So we're back with lesson one. It's part two. We've done some introductions and we've gone over the course. So you'll need to go under assignments and complete the academic integrity policy in order that you can get into the week one folder. So we're going to do a little research kind of using this little whiteboard, this website called Miro. We're going to use this whiteboard often. I'll put the link in the chat as well. So if you open this up in a new tab, so we've got some basic questions here about ASP.NET. So you'll see here for the whiteboard. So there's 5 questions, right? And so how do you know which question to answer? So if you look on Blackboard, down in under groups, each one of you should be in an activity group. So we've got 5 activity groups. We'll use these if we do some like small breakout room activities and things. And whether you're in class live now or you're watching later, you can find your group here. It'll say if you're in activity group 1, I want you to do a little research online and post a yellow sticky note here under the first question. So if you're in group 1, your question is, what are some benefits of using ASP.NET? So you can just create a sticky note in the board and choose yellow if you're in group 1. Put a sticky note on with a really brief answer and also include your name. If you're in group 2, you're answering question 2. If you're in group 3, you're answering question 3. If you're in group 4, answer question 4. If you're in group 5, answer question 5. And kind of follow along as Marilo has done here. Put in your answer and put your name on your sticky note as well. Okay, so follow the Miro board link, grab a sticky note, and answer the question that's assigned to your group. Okay. I'm going to pause the recording about 5 minutes or so, for 5 to 10 minutes for you to find out some answers online and post your sticky note on the board. And then we'll review some of the comments and notes and resume the recording in a few minutes. So I'm just going to pause. So a little bit of chaos. That's okay. So what we find out, I'm not going to go over everything here, but just some of the important points. So some of the reasons to use .NET, Chris mentioned that it's cross-platform. It didn't used to be. Used to be Windows only. Yeah, we can write a lot less code, and we've got faster render times. That's absolutely right, Jason. So Visual Studio is a powerhouse, and it's going to do an awful lot of automation for us, which is going to save us development time. Tanya mentioned we can use any programming language. All true. So Boer gave us a good explanation of MVC. So model, view, and controller. So model works with our data. The view is our front end. So in our case, our views are going to be HTML views. But in other applications, the views might be mobile front end. It might be desktop. Might be something else. And the controller layer acts as the logic. It's the interface. It's the bridge between the user interface and our data. Okay, so we'll talk more about this. So MVC is not native to .NET, but it's used widely in .NET, and you're going to be using MVC next semester in your JavaScript frameworks course as well. Okay, so it's a pattern or an architecture. It's a way of building applications. So why do we use it? So Cameron mentioned we can show multiple views with one model. That's true. We can do side-by-side development. Kripa, can you explain what you mean? This is really important. Can you explain either within the chat or with the mic? What did you mean by side-by-side development? You're absolutely right about it. Could you tell us a bit more about what that means? Okay, so you're saying means parallel development. Yep. Bukra, good guess. Client and server side. Um, it's actually, it makes working in a team environment much easier because things are broken down into different components. So we'll look at that, and Jay mentioned it can speed the development process. We'll look at this a bit more. So it facilitates the structure of the software architecture, absolutely. And Isadora talked around separation of concerns. So Isadora, can you explain what you mean about this? This is really important. What does this mean if we're dividing the model controller and view? What's the benefit to this? Okay, Bugra, yeah, that's a good point. Let's have a look. It's definitely easier to separate visually for sure. So here's, Bugra, you mentioned PHP, so that's a good example. Here's a page that I built last semester in PHP class. Just open it up. In Comp1006. Right, in PHP, we don't have a separation of concerns, right? We've got some server logic here, checking authentication. Sorry, not a good example. Where's the page I want? This one. Right, we've got a bunch of logic here. We've got inserting of a header, a bunch of variables declared, a bunch of logic connecting to the database. Then we've got a bunch of HTML presentation. And then we've got more server-side code injected. Logic to fill a drop-down list. Again, another database connection with the query. So our logic and our presentation, it's all mashed together. It's all in one file. It makes debugging difficult, and it makes dividing the work among members of the team difficult because so much code, different code doing different things is in one file. MVC is designed to divide these things. We separate the database component out into a model. We separate all the HTML out into the view, and then all the logic that interacts, that all goes in our controller. So I'm just reading Dan's comment here. Right, it gives us logical components built for handling specific things. Yep, it allows us to organize dependencies as well. So we get full control over our HTML. It gives us rapid development. Absolutely. So we're going to use .NET Core, which is newer than the .NET framework. Why? Because .NET Core, as Needy said, it's faster. .NET framework can also be used for desktop. Core is for web. .NET Core is cross-platform, as Connor mentioned, whereas .NET Framework is Windows only. And Jill mentioned that as well. And Sviatoslav mentioned the same. .NET Framework is for server-based apps as well, to run on Windows. So we're seeing that. And Adam mentioned, yeah, it integrates with Microsoft Real Estate, really all Microsoft products. So Azure Cloud Services, it integrates with things like Office and SharePoint, SQL Server, all these things integrate well with .NET. Okay, so some really good answers there. Going to do a little bit of a brief introduction of my own. It's going to touch on a number of the things that you guys collectively have added to the Miro board. So .NET has actually, it's a very mature product. It's now 19 years old. I remember purchasing the first version of Visual Studio.NET back in 2002. And it was based on Microsoft's earlier web technology called Active Server Pages. So that's where the name ASP comes from. So when I started building pages, web scripts in the late 90s, those files had .asp extensions, and we used VB script, so a form of Visual Basic. And it was an interpreted scripting language. So back then, programming for web in the Microsoft world, it was very much like programming in PHP. Similar thing. And in 2000s, Microsoft said, there's a lot of things we can do to improve this technology and make this better. So one of the things we wanted to offer was ASP.NET was the first compiled web framework. Before .NET came along, all web pages, all the code was interpreted the way PHP is interpreted. And interpreted code is slow. It's slow and it's not as secure as compiled code. So one of the main motivations for coming up with .NET was the ability for compiled code to run web applications. It also incorporates OO principles into web development, which was not common 20 years ago. And it allowed us to create a single code base where we could build an application and have a web front end or a desktop front end, but all of the back end logic and code was the same. In 2008, they added the Mvc pattern, and then .NET Core was created 5 years ago. So the goal was up until 2016, .NET was Windows only. So the idea was to write an open source cross-platform web framework that was also focused on performance. Largely, .NET is targeted for medium and large scale enterprises. We can use it for small applications, but it was designed kind of for the enterprise in mind. And as developers, ASP.NET does a lot of stuff for us. It compiles our code, so it's more secure and it runs faster. We have this really wide range of tools in Visual Studio. And Visual Studio automates a lot of tasks. So many of the things we had to do manually in languages like PHP, ASP.NET and Visual Studio are going to do for us. We're going to get the benefits of using MVC, and we can integrate with things like some of the services I mentioned earlier. SQL Server, Azure Cloud Hosting, and integrated with GitHub for version control, which is now owned by Microsoft as well. It has a built-in authentication and authorization model. So for us to do things like register users, hash passwords, manage user roles and permissions, we don't have to write hardly any code. All these things are baked right into the ASP.NET framework. So we can just leverage these libraries and dependencies. Visual Studio also offers a bunch of cool tools for us. One of the big things it offers is runtime debugging. So we can load a web page in the browser and step through the server-side code at runtime to see how it's behaving and why. It's got all kinds of project templates for building web apps with different kinds of front ends like Angular or React. It gives us a skeleton for our UI. So when we go to create a new project, Visual Studio is automatically going to include Bootstrap. It's going to include jQuery, and it's going to include a template that gives us a header and footer. We can change that stuff, but we don't have to build our app totally from scratch. It's got built-in security libraries for things like registration, login, two-factor authentication, and social authentication. It's got a dependency manager so we can easily add third-party code libraries, and it's designed for doing unit testing and version control. We're going to use all of these features in this course. So this is how MVC works. Again, it's not native to Microsoft or ASP.NET. It's a structure, it's a pattern, or a way of putting applications together. So this is how they interact. Let's say we have this domain. We've got this website. I'll put it in the chat. Some domain.com/orders/detail/1000. What would you expect to see at this URL that's in blue here? Yep, sounds good, Eduardo. That's great. Thanks for joining us today. So if you looked at this URL, some website /orders/details/1000. Okay, so it would, Murilo is saying, would probably give you information. Connor's saying would give you information about the details of order with ID 1000. Right. So yeah, I'm seeing lots of good answers in the chat. So this is how this works. So client clicks a link that takes them to orders details 1000. So the URL pattern in MVC is really important. The dispatcher looks for a file in the controllers folder called orders controller. And in this controller, this logic file, there's going to be a method called details. And this method will take a parameter of 1000. It'll be an integer. So this controller method is then going to talk to the order model and say, hey, go to the database and fetch order 1000. The model will query the database and it will return an object to the controller. And then Jason said it will ultimately load a view. It will. So the controller gets that data back from the model, and then it's going to load a view that's in the views folder, then the order subfolder, and it's going to be called details.cshtml. This is our extension for views in ASP.NET. And it's going to pass in order 1000 so the user can see the details of that order. So we have really descriptive URLs. Okay, so you can see in this instance, the controller is the logic. It's the go-between or the back and forth between the view and the model. It takes requests from the browser, it fetches data or sends data to the database, and then it sends responses back, typically in the form of views, to the browser. So the benefits, we talked about separation of concerns, right? So our code for working with the database, our code for working with the UI, and our code for doing the logic are all separated into different files. So we have more files, but those files are smaller. Our code is organized and modular, unlike this kind of a mess we've got in PHP. We can reuse components. We can also divide the labor. So let's say Eric, Chris, and Bugra are working together on a project. Bugra might be doing all the views. He's designing the UI. Eric is doing all the logic. He works in the controllers. And Chris does the models. Or maybe each one of them works with a different section. Someone does orders, someone does customers, someone does products. So we can easily divide the work. And it's easier for us to test and debug this way. We'll come back to this in a bit. So let's create, we're not going to work with this in the future, but we're just going to create a sample, kind of a dummy throwaway project for today with Visual Studio, so we can explore what an ASP.NET Core project looks like, what are some of the files in it, and how does it basically work. Won't take us this long. We're not going to need our full 3 hours for class today. So let's open up Visual Studio. And we're going to create our first .NET Core web application. Like I said, this will be a throwaway project. We'll create another project next week, and then we're going to work in that same project every week. So this is why it'll be important if you miss class, you'll want to watch the video and catch up so that your project is not behind. So we are going to build out starting next week, starting with me and continuing with your lessons with Eduardo. We're actually going to build an e-commerce store. We're going to build a shopping cart with payments and order history, and we're going to add on to it each week in class. So let's open up Visual Studio, and we're going to create a new project. So once Visual Studio is open, we'll click on Create a New Project. close a few windows here. Things slow. Okay. So in the search for templates, if we search for ASP.NET Core, I'll put that in the chat. So if you search for ASP.NET Core, we want this one. Which is sorry, we want this one. It's going to be ASP.NET Core Web App Model View Controller. So I've put in the chat the option that we want. And there's two of them here. There's one in F#. We want C#. We're going to be leveraging your C# skills from last semester in this class. So all our server-side code's written in C#. I think this is the one we want. So pick ASP.NET Core Web App Model View Controller. Click Next. I'll just leave the name as Web Application 1 for today, because we're not going to use this project other than for today's lesson. I'll click Next. The target framework doesn't really matter. I'll pick .NET 5. That's our current. For authentication, I'll pick individual user accounts. Doesn't really matter. You can leave it at none. And normally we'll configure our site to use HTTPS. We'll talk about this later in the semester. Doesn't really matter for today whether this is checked or not. So what options you pick here don't really matter. If you don't have .NET 5 and you pick .NET 3.1 for today, that's fine. And I'll click Create. And this will take a minute for Visual Studio to run. It's going to build a project template for us. So it's going to give us an actual working website right away. But it'll take a minute to install all the dependencies we need and create the project. So we'll just let this run. I'm not entirely sure I wanted this option and not the one that just said Core Web App without MVC, but that's probably fine. Okay, if you did not get the option, so Simran, you didn't get any options for ASP.NET? Did you get one that said ASP.NET Core Web App? Okay, you can pick that one. It's fine. So if we look in Solution Explorer, here's what we get. So let's have a little look around. We've got some dependencies. So a few different libraries. So notice there's already a library here for talking to SQL Server. Under www root, we've already got folders here for our static assets. So there's a CSS, JavaScript, and library folder, and a default favicon. So under CSS, we get a little CSS file. So it gives us some CSS we can delete or modify. Under lib, notice we've got Bootstrap, jQuery, and jQuery validation all included. So we don't have to use those things, but they're all here. Areas we won't really worry about for now. We've got a controller called the home controller. Let's have a look. So in our controller, we've got two methods, primary. We've got an index method and a privacy method. We'll poke around and explore how this works in a bit. And each one of them returns a view. We've got a database connection object already here called application DB context. We've got a models folder that's empty. And then under views, we've got home. And notice we've got two pages here, index and privacy. And each one of them's got some HTML. It's also got this code here that starts with the @ symbol. What do you suppose the @ symbol means in a .NET view? Notice it turns yellow. So we've got this little block of code here that starts with an @ symbol. Good guess, Connor. It's not actually using a session, but you're close. Good guess, Eric. Okay, so it is this is a variable. Is it a client side or server side? Where you see this @ symbol. Right, so the @ symbol, this indicates it's server-side code. So any server-side code in our .NET views are prefixed with the @ symbol. So we don't have opening and closing tags like we do in PHP, right? We've got closing and opening. There's no closing tag. We simply open with an @ symbol. And if it's a block of code, we nest it in curly braces. So this is server-side code. So it's a little easier than the PHP tags. We've also got a shared folder in views, and in here, we've got a file called _layout. So let's have a look here. Right, we've got a heading. So our page title is a server-side variable that shows up in the title tag. We've got Bootstrap already included. Cool, we get a navigation bar, a collapsible Bootstrap nav bar, so it's mobile responsive. And we've got a couple of links here. And you'll notice in the middle of my screen, there's a few tags that aren't standard HTML. What do you see that's not standard HTML? Looking at my screen. Right, we've got ASP area. We've got a partial name, so that's like an include file. And then we've got ASP controller and ASP action, right? So we've got these extra ASP properties inside these standard links. So we'll look at how these work in a minute. We've got our page body, which gets injected as a server variable. And then we've got a footer with things like jQuery and that our scripts get rendered asynchronously. They're deferred. So we actually get a page layout without writing any code. Now, if this was PHP, right, what did we need to do to load any PHP sites that we built locally? We wanted to run them and load them in our browser. We needed to use another tool to do that. Right, we had to run a server, so you probably use something like XAMPP or WAMP or MAMP, right? We had to install it separately and make sure the server was running. Here's one of the other cool features of Visual Studio. Visual Studio comes with its own built-in web server. So for whoever asked earlier, why can't we use VS Code? Well, VS Code, this is one of the features it doesn't have. So if we want to start our web server, if I click on the debug menu, I'm going to choose Start Without Debugging. So when I click Start Without Debugging, Visual Studio is going to first compile all our C# code. So it's going to run, it's going to build, and notice it creates, if I go back here, it says it's successfully running on a local port. So it uses a built-in web server called IIS Express. So we don't need a separate web server. And now I get this. Notice it's trying to run with HTTPS. It's looking for an SSL certificate, which it doesn't like. I'm just going to click Advanced. It says, we don't trust your certificate because it's self-signed. I don't care about this. Just working locally. So I'm just going to click Accept the risk and continue. There's no risk here. So I'm going to load the website. And notice we get a working site. Got a home page. There's a navigation bar with 2 links. Home, privacy. Because I chose individual user accounts for security when we created the project, we also get register and login links. And when we click them, we get a functional register and login page. It even tells us about setting up an external login service, right? It's got a forget your password page. It's got a privacy policy. And our site uses Bootstrap, so it's mobile responsive. Right. Scale it down to mobile scale. We get our little pop-up menu. Right? How many lines of code have we written for this? 0. Right? So you can see how much time saving this, obviously we can get rid of, we're going to change this, but this is a great place to start. So we want to look at how MVC works. Okay. So let's say we want to make a new page here. We want to make a new page and put a link to it in the navigation bar. So we've got home and privacy. Let's say we want an About Us page. So the first question is, which file would we open to add a new link into the navigation bar? If we want a new link here, which file would this be in? It is a view. Yeah, Murillo, that's okay. You should still be able to follow along. Right, so Adam and Connor, that's right. So if we go to our views, shared, our underscore layout, we can make a few changes here. Okay, you're free to try to use VS Code, but I have a feeling there's going to be certain things we do that you may not be able to. If it's working for you, that's great. So what line number should we add our new link on? I'm going to leave the links we have. Okay, so after line 26, let's add thanks, Adam and friends. We'll add a new li tag, give it a class of nav item, and we'll just put in a new link, class of nav link text dark. We don't need ASP area. So the links in .NET work a little differently. Notice we don't have an href property. We're not linking to another file. We're going to call a controller and then call a specific action or method inside. So which controller should we use? How many controllers are there? Yeah, we're going to call the home controller. And we're going to create a new method here. So we're going to call it about. Okay, so here's our new link. Oops. So we're creating a new li, a new anchor tag, and we're going to set the ASP controller to home and ASP action to about. So we're adding lines 27 to 29. I've put them in the chat, but I would recommend you type them because copying and pasting, you don't internalize things the way you do when you type them yourself. So I'm just going to go back and refresh. So now notice our link shows up here. We had 2 links, now we have 3. If we view the page source, notice that ASP controller and ASP action, it does get converted at runtime to a standard href tag. So that those are that's server-side code that gets translated. We don't see ASP controller and ASP action in the page source at runtime. So I'll try my link when I click about. How come we get this blank screen? It calls the right URL, but why is the screen blank? Right, we didn't set it up. So it's this kind of a 3-step process. We've done the first step, which is add a link. So what should our second step be? Yep. Okay, so we need a view. So let's go ahead and create the view. So in Solution Explorer, under Views, and Home, I'm going to right-click the Home folder. I'm going to add a view. And we just want it to be an empty view. And we just have to give it a name of About. We don't have to specify the extension. It's automatically going to get the extension CSHTML. So it's an empty Razor view. We won't be too much longer. We should wrap up by 1 o'clock and we'll be done. We won't have a third part of class. Okay, Jillian, 1 step ahead of me. So yes, So call a view about, and again, you can type the extension or you can leave it out. Click add. So here's our page. So notice it gives us some server-side code here. And we'll just put on maybe an H1. This is about this site. This is our first ASP.NET MVC site. You can say whatever you want here. So I'm just going to put on an H1 and a paragraph tag, just some really basic standard HTML. Okay. So now I'm going to go back to my browser and refresh. So now we have a view under Views and Home. But when we refresh, let's see if it loads. Still a blank screen. So we're calling the right URL. We have the view in the right folder. So Jillian, why doesn't it work? Right, because we're missing the controller, right? We're dispatching this URL. We have a view, but the controller has to take the URL and tell our application what to do. It needs to load the view. So the logic piece is missing. No problem. So we need to go to our home controller. And after our privacy method, I'm going to make a new method. It returns a class called iActionResult. So there's different kinds of results. Most of the time we want to return a view. We're going to call it about. And when this method is called, we want to return a view. Okay, so here's our method. We'll play around with it. We'll modify it in a minute. Now we've changed the C#. So I'm going to just refresh now. And notice it's going to be a little slow because when we change server-side code, our application has to get recompiled. And now our About page works. So to create a new page, we needed to do three things. We needed a link to it in our navbar. We needed to create the view. And then we needed to create the controller method with the same name. The naming convention is really important. Because notice we didn't specify which view to load. Yet all three of these links work properly. When I click Home, I get this view. Privacy, I get this one. About, I get this one. So the view names have to match the controller names exactly. I'll show you what happens when they're not. I'm going to rename my view to About Us. You don't have to do this on yours. This is just for showing. So I've changed the name now. Now when I click About, right, the view About was not found. We searched in Views, Home, About. We searched in Views, Shared About, and we searched Pages, Shared About. Couldn't find it. So by default, the method names have to match the view names. If you want to load a view with a different name, you can, but you would have to specify it like this. this will now let my about method load the view called about us. You don't have to change yours. I'm just showing you how the naming conventions work. So if I refresh now, it can load the view with the different name. But this is not recommended. The recommended practice is that the method name should match. I'm going to rename it back the proper way. So we shouldn't have to specify what view do we want to load. It should have the same name. One other thing to note about naming in the .NET world, Microsoft uses Pascal case. So when you are creating files or methods, they should always start with a capital. Right, unlike Java, which uses camel case. In fact, if I call my name my method like this, notice Visual Studio highlights it and it says you violated the naming convention. Your method has to begin with a capital. And it gives me a little code prompt here to fix it. So this is something for Java programmers. And you guys have done more Java than you have C#, you'll need to get used to, because you're probably in the habit of naming your methods and your classes in camel case. Notice also the class name, right? Our namespace, Pascal case, class name, Pascal case, everything in Microsoft. I've been working as a Microsoft programmer since 1999. It's all Pascal case. So you'll have to get used to that, right? All their classes, everything is named in Pascal case. So to create a file, we're going to create the view. We create the controller. We're going to do one more quick thing and then we'll finish here. We're going to look at a really simple way of passing a value from the controller to the view and then displaying it. So we'll look more at this over the next couple weeks, but there's an object called the view bag. It's kind of like this empty container where we can define variables, and then those variables will be available in our view. So we'll say view bag dot, let's say, current time equals, we'll say datetime.now. So by setting this variable and putting it in the view bag, we can then display it in our view. And we don't need to use the annoying PHP echo command. Okay, so let's add. Now, we don't use the view bag for complex data, and this is the last thing we're going to do. We only use it for simple data, like we want to pass an error message or like a simple value. We're not going to pass like an order list or a customer profile in the view bag. We'd use a complex object for that. So now on the about, we can say the current time is, and then we can just use our server side, our @ symbol, viewbag dot current time. I think that's what I called it. Yep. So then if we output this, every time we load the about page, it's going to show us the current date and time. So no need for an echo to print out any value from the server. Just prefix it with the @ symbol. So now if we refresh, now it's going to show so we can use the view bag to pass simple data from the controller so that we can render it in our view. So the last thing I'm going to show you just for today, and then we're pretty much done, is we've talked about the code being compiled, right? But we don't see it here. So where is the compiled code? If I build my project, actually, you know what I'll do is I'll actually just open my project in Windows. So if I right click my solution and say open in File Explorer, here's my solution. The web project is in its own folder. Here's all the same folders we see in Visual Studio, except I also have a bin folder. And in the debug and .NET 5, I've got all the dependencies, and down here, this web application 1 DLL, this has all the C# code. So every time we build or compile the project, all our C# is compiled down to this DLL. Okay, so this contains all our server-side code in this compiled file. So it's more secure and it performs better than an uncompiled file. A couple of other files we're going to work with are appsettings.json. This is a configuration file. So for places like things like our database connection string, which we'll work with in a few weeks, API keys, things like that, they go in this JSON file. And any startup code, we have a startup.cs. So if we want to configure things like security or social sign-in, we'll configure them in this startup file. So we'll work in here a lot later on. So these are kind of like boilerplate files that we can override and customize. Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's class. So the only thing you have to do for next week, if you haven't added to the Miro whiteboard, please add a sticky note to it. And I'll just make this image available for you to review. Yep, I will, Tanya. So for next week, you do have a quiz. So it's in the week 2 folder. I can actually open it up now. But I would recommend you do the quiz next week. Do it Monday or Tuesday as a review before coming to class on Wednesday. But I can make it available now. But I'd recommend doing the quiz a little bit later as a review before next week's class. So Tanya, you mean you want to just launch the site in your browser? Click on debug and start without debugging. That starts the web server or reloads it in the browser. Okay, so if your stuff is working, that's great. You're free to go. Have a great week, and I'll see you next week. I'm happy to stay in the WebEx room for a little while if anyone has questions or needs help. Okay, have a great week. I will upload the recordings a little bit later this afternoon, and the playlist is on Blackboard. Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining. See you next week.